Now I'd like to talk to you about South Sudan's oil and their connections to corruption and conflict within the country. I included a link to several videos that provided background information about the specific conflict. Hopefully you've watched those and thought about the issues and the impacts of oil production on conflict. There's another one I didn't have time for. I'll put a link in the description that shows with the declining oil prices during the COVID pandemic had a direct effect on the country's ability to raise revenue. That the oil agreements that South Sudan struck with Sudan as part of the reaching an independence agreement holding the referendum was that South Sudan would pay a certain amount per barrel to Sudan to transport the oil to the coast because South Sudan is landlocked. The only way to get the oil to export markets was by through the pipeline through Sudan. But with the declining price in oil, South Sudan actually had to pay the Sudanese government to be able to export their oil. They were losing money on the oil production, which could go to some ways to understand the collapse in the oil exports in recent years, which we're going to be talking about in a second. I think this is a great example of a case of resource and conflict interdependence, both in the experience of what used to be the unified Sudan from the 1950s up until through 2011 independence and breakaway of South Sudan, but also the difficulty in creating an independent country that's landlocked and heavily dependent on one resource, in which you have an ethnic fractionalization between two large ethnic groups, as you can see in the video, connects to our discussion of ethnic fractionalization in earlier weeks and the politicization of it. There's a lot of other resources out there if you're curious about the South Sudanese case. I also wanted to highlight a resource that if you're interested in understanding the basics about any of the countries that we've covered in this class, more time than I have to be able to present a lot of the characteristics and dynamics and history of these countries, I'd like to point you towards this YouTube channel, Geography Now, that has almost 3 million subscribers. When I took this last snapshot, I think what's also great about their series is they try to bring people from the country to help present information from it. It's not getting this northern perspective the entire time and trying to describe countries, often in developing countries. This video, I think, is a half an hour long. But if you're bored, if you're interested, I would encourage you to take a look at it. I think it's interesting to get that kind of in-depth context about countries that often don't get as much attention in Australian or Western media. With the South Sudan example, I think it is shaped by the experience, interests, and interactions of three main players. Two that you saw mentioned in the video, the current president Kiir and the former vice president Riek Machar. Both of them were raised in that kind of conflict with South Sudan. You might not have heard the name of the gentleman in the middle, John Garang. He had a PhD in, I think, agriculture from Indiana, some Midwestern university. He was one of the largest and most influential figure in South Sudanese politics before independence, and he died shortly after independence or before independence. I forget exactly when, but he reminded me a lot of Ahmad Shah Massoud in Afghanistan, someone that was seen as a unifying and uniquely influential independence figure within the state that I think it's a counterfactual. You only have one country. You can't see what would have happened if he had lived, but that there was some expectation that John Garang would have this large, unifying, George Washington-esque kind of figure in the newly independent state that would be able to bring the fractured politics of South Sudan together to be able to provide some kind of hope at stability. But unfortunately, after his death and after independence, only the two, Kir and Machar, were left. Kir is a Dinka, while Machar is a Nuer. And the civil war and the millions of people that fled from it have played a huge role in the lack of development, both within the country as well as the effects in the neighboring region. Connecting it to the migration week a couple of weeks ago, you can look at satellite photos of the border region with Uganda before and after independence. The largest refugee camp, I think, until maybe the last year with the Ukrainian conflict, was over the border in Uganda, in which you had almost 1 million people living in one refugee camp, and how quickly it was created from nothing. You now have satellite data to watch that. It's quite dramatic. But you do see with the UCDP, you can get information, but you can just see from the figure here how widespread the clashes have been between the two sides over in recent years. There's been a recent peace agreement and hope for longer stability and avoidance of violence. Hopefully that will stick. UCDP is not the only information. If you're looking at a particular conflict for your own papers, often I point students towards UCDP, but there's also ACLID and country-specific data sets that you can use, like this resource from SIPO, the Mapping Conflict Violence in South Sudan. It's a bottom-up local measure, which I'm a strong believer in, trying to avoid the potential biases relying on Western media reports of violence. There's an established literature on that in the conflict side of things, that you can get these kind of more bottom-up violence measures. Sri Lanka, there's another one that has an example of that. But I think in looking at the north, you can see the clustering of not as much of the higher amounts of violence, but there was some in the oil-producing regions. Right after the violence started, that there was a push towards displacement. Honestly, there's been a long history in South Sudan of trying to displace people off territory to be able to produce oil. Once the violence started, there was an increasing sense that some of these areas would become targets, including the Paloch oil fields that you see here as a battleground back in 2015. Other ones as well. A lot of the international corporations that provide facilities to getting the oil out of the ground also hire their own security details that might have greater capacity than the government, but still they are frequent targets, which can go some ways to help explaining the reduction in oil production. You see the dramatic decrease in pre-independence and post-independence economic oil production. It's really hard to get good data on this. A couple different sources. This is from the U.S. EIA, but from Trading Economics, they take their data from the World Bank. You do see some gaps during the worst of the fighting, in which just wasn't that much oil production at all. But you see this quite hope and optimism after independence in 2011, 2012, and 2013. The total GDP of the country, which is basically entirely dependent on oil production, reached over $18 billion US. And if you remember, and then you remember the earlier video, the current exports were about $850 million US. But then after the war started, you saw basically a dramatic decrease over the next couple of years in total oil production. One of the videos talked about the efforts to try to increase the oil production capacity again, and you can see small amounts since in 2019 and estimates for 2020 through 2022 that will increase, but it's still a fraction of the scale in which it used to be able to export oil. Even more dramatic decline, I would argue, than the Venezuelan case that we've covered in this class already, which kind of makes this graph even more dramatic, that this shows a uniform size, but the size has shrunk quite dramatically, even if the percentages for where it goes hasn't changed that much. And of course, mentioning the duration of conflict and how oil can affect how wars are fought. There's been some press reports accusing the oil consortiums of funding militias, which have gone on to conduct atrocities. War is always a horrible thing, and atrocities do happen. But there has, as you saw with the Vice news video, there have been widespread allegations of a lot of war crimes, as well as a lot of corruption by those actors that might stand to benefit from some of this instability. Of course, they would also benefit by actually having stability so they can export more oil. George Clooney made a cameo in the video releasing a report highlighting corruption. There's been a number of other reports. This is the one that they were speaking of, in which they do have an amazing amount of granular level detail on how corporations from international actors, including Australia, you can see in the beginning, that have connections through international corporations to people in the president's family, as well as the president themselves, that have an effect on corrupting the political system and allocating resources to the top, not necessarily to those people who are in clear need of it, as in that hospital in the video in the capital of Juba. So these oil fields can lead to incentives for attacks, for atrocities, for corruption, not necessarily very many things. The last thing I'll mention is kidnappings, that by and large they are geographically fixed. They are not easy to move. They're not easy to hide. The infrastructure requires a large amount of money and attention that can make it uniquely subject to attack. I think Nigeria would be another example in which you have local citizens much more active in attacking the actual oil producing facilities because of dissatisfaction of how the money is spent. You don't hear that much about the citizens attacking the production in South Sudan. This Paloch oil field here, where they had the kidnapping as well as the earlier attacks, one of the largest and more influential ones. You see it at the periphery of the South Sudanese state, similar to our discussion of the importance of being in the center or the periphery to might make it easier or harder to control. You see Juba down south and the Paloch oil fields far in the north. And the citizens haven't necessarily attacked, but they have protested these oil facilities because of the environmental cost of the production. A whole human security realm that I haven't talked about that much today because I focused on the conflict side of it, but there are a lot of demonstrated negative health effects on citizens in South Sudan, the oil producing regions. I remember getting my PhD in upstate New York near Pennsylvania, just when the fracking boom was getting started, and there was a huge interest of farmers to try to sign over mineral access to the land, and they can get a huge amount of money right off the bat for that. However, there's been increasing evidence as to the health impacts and the environmental damage of oil production, not just in South Sudan, but also in areas of quite developed parts of the United States, like New York or in Texas. Getting back to South Sudan, I mentioned the ceasefire and the hope for trying to get more stability. There's been talk of trying to get more foreign direct investment to try to increase oil production, as well as through spending on telecommunications networks. In my research, I mentioned back in week 1, connecting to this class on foreign direct investment, after conflict ends, some foreign direct investment, some corporations are much more likely to take the risk in going into countries that are even in ongoing conflict or ones that recently ended. Telecommunications companies are often some of the most ambitious in trying to get into states that are in current conflict or recently out of them. And it's a really fascinating example of highly concentrated resources through these kind of cell towers that they can put up around the country, and the possible positive effects on people's day-to-day lives and getting information out about what people are actually doing in their lived experiences in the country. I saw that firsthand in Myanmar when I was there during the 2015 election, but then also in allowing farmers to get accurate price information, weather information, news about what's actually going on. But then also it can be important for governments maintaining control by shutting down access to certain websites or certain amounts of information. And so you see this tension of oil exploration and benefits that hardly any of it follows and has a positive effect on the individual level, while you have information or telecommunications infrastructure that could also be controlled and influenced by national level, but that there is more of a direct individual level impact that I think all of us can more directly relate to. Anyway, side note. One of the incentives to try to bring the conflict to a close could be from those international actors that stand to gain from stability. So you can see domestic actors that could stand to benefit from ongoing conflict. The international actors are more interested in more dependable resource production to get that production back up to where it used to be. And so I showed you in that graph how dependent South Sudan is on Chinese oil producing corporations, and you see them taking a strong statement in the start of the current period to try to end the finding in 2020 to try to encourage that. So I think it connects a lot of ways, the domestic and the international aspects that we've covered in this class so far. With that, I will turn to now a couple of other international aspects in the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I have a couple of videos about those, but I want to turn to now the international efforts against this resource curse that's had negative impacts in a whole host of countries, including South Sudan. So let's turn to international efforts, which will give us a little hint on what we're going to be talking about for the last week of the class in week 12.